I came home from a 2-day trip and found myself locked out of my own ranch. Not by thieves, not by squatters, not by some government agency, but by a homeowners association that had absolutely no business touching my land. A 7-foot steel fence wrapped around my entire property like a prison wall, and hanging from the only gate was a shiny padlock with a brand new sign that read private property, no trespassing. I stood there staring at it for a second, honestly wondering if I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. Then it hit me. They had actually done it. They had fenced me out of my own ranch. My name is Cole Mercer. I and Oppos am 44 years old, a retired smoke jumper, and for the last few years I and Oppos have been living on a quiet stretch of ranch land outside a small Texas town called Dry Creek. After spending most of my life jumping out of airplanes into wildfires, I wanted peace. Just horses, peach trees, open skies, and enough silence to hear myself think. For a while, that and Oppos, that's exactly what I had. Then the developers arrived. They bought hundreds of acres bordering my property and built a polished little subdivision called Silver Hollow Estates. At first, I didn't Oppos care. People can build wherever they want. The problem wasn't Oppos the houses. The problem was the HOA that came with them. The letters started showing up first. Polite at the beginning, then increasingly ridiculous. One complained that my red barn was visible from the subdivision entrance and didn't Oppos fit the community aesthetic. Another suggested relocating my tractor because it negatively impacted neighborhood views. I laughed every time I opened one. My property wasn't Oppos part of their HOA. They had exactly as much authority over me as my horse had over Congress. Apparently, they didn't Oppos appreciate my sense of humor. A few months later, one of their board members showed up at my gate. His name was Preston Vale. Perfect hair, expensive sunglasses, and the kind of smile that always looked like it belonged on a billboard for a lawsuit. He spent 10 minutes explaining how cooperation between neighbors was important. Then he suggested I repaint my barn, move my equipment, and possibly install decorative fencing that matched the neighborhood standards. I asked him if he and Oppos like a complimentary wheelbarrow full of horse manure to complete the aesthetic experience. He didn't Oppos laugh. After that, strange things started happening. Survey flags appeared near my boundary lines. Men with clipboards walked around taking pictures. Contractors parked along the road staring toward my property. Every instinct I had told me something was brewing. So I checked county records, reviewed my deeds, and made sure every inch of my land was exactly where it was supposed to be. Everything checked out. Legally, they couldn't Oppos touch me. Or so I thought. Then my mother called. She and Oppos had minor surgery in Houston and needed help for a couple of days. I packed a bag, drove down there, and stayed until she was back on her feet. 2 days later, I came home and found the fence. The HOA had purchased a tiny strip of land that connected to the only access point leading into my ranch. They never crossed onto my property. Instead, they built around it. Technically legal, morally insane. They controlled the gate, the lock, and the only practical entrance. Standing there that evening, staring at that fence while the sun disappeared behind the hills, I realized something important. They expected me to explode. They expected lawyers, threats, and angry phone calls. Instead, I smiled, because a different idea had just entered my mind. If they wanted to play a property game, they had no idea who they were playing against. 3 days later, my friend Wade called me back. Wade worked commercial real estate deals all over Texas and knew how to dig through property records better than most attorneys. The second I answered, he was already laughing. End quote. Cole, you and Oppos, we're gonna love this. End quote. End quote. Tell me. End quote. End quote. The developer sold the HOA the strip under the gate, but he kept another piece. End quote. I sat up straighter. End quote. What kind of piece? End quote. End quote. A narrow access parcel directly behind it. Connects to the county road. Nobody paid attention to it because it and Oppos tiny. End quote. I didn't and Oppos even let him finish. End quote. Can I buy it? End quote. There was a pause. Then Wade laughed harder. End quote. I already knew that would be your first question. End quote. 2 days later, the deed was in my name. Just like that, I owned the only practical access route to the gate they were so proud of. And sitting on that parcel happened to be a maintenance shed used by the HOA and Oppos as contractors. A maintenance shed that contained, among other things, the master key for the gate. I didn't Apos, T announce anything. Didn't Apos, T post online. Didn't Apos, T call lawyers. I simply waited. Saturday morning arrived, and Silver Hollow Estates held its monthly community festival. Families, food trucks, bounce houses, live music, the whole suburban dream package. Around noon, I drove my old pickup right onto my newly acquired parcel and parked where everyone could see me. Then I climbed out carrying a giant red sign. Private property. No trespassing. As I started hammering it into the ground, Preston Vale came charging across the grass like his hair was on fire. End quote. What exactly do you think you and Apos redoing? End quote. He demanded. I smiled. End quote. Installing a sign. End quote. End quote. You can and Apos, T do that here. End quote. End quote. Sure I can. End quote. End quote. This property belongs to Silver Hollow Estates. End quote. I pulled the deed from my pocket and handed it to him. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like somebody unplugged him. End quote. Not anymore. End quote. For the first time since I and Apos D met him, Preston had absolutely nothing to say. Then I reached into my pocket and held up the gate key. End quote. Funny thing about property ownership, end quote. I said. End quote. Sometimes it comes with accessories. End quote. The crowd nearby started whispering. Phones came out. People were recording. Preston looked like he wanted the earth to open and swallow him whole. But that was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to a convoy of SUVs rolling toward my ranch. 7 vehicles. Lawyers, board members, and a woman named Veronica Hale, the HOA and Apos legal counsel. She stepped out carrying a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. End quote. Mr. Mercer, end quote. She said. End quote. You and Apos hereby notified that your property has been classified as an internal green space within the secured perimeter of Silver Hollow Estates. End quote. I blinked. End quote. You classified my ranch as what? End quote. End quote. Internal green space. End quote. End quote. You mean a park? End quote. She cleared her throat. End quote. Not officially. End quote. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. They weren't and Apos, T joking. They had actually filed paperwork attempting to reclassify my ranch as community land because their fence surrounded it. Somewhere, somehow, a group of adults sat in a conference room and convinced themselves this was a reasonable strategy. That afternoon, I called my cousin Luke. Luke wasn't Apos, T just family. He was one of the nastiest land use attorneys in Texas. The kind of attorney who smiled when someone threatened litigation. After hearing the story, he was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then he started laughing. End quote. They did what? End quote. I repeated it. He laughed harder. End quote. Cole, Don and Apos, T worry. They and Apos, about to learn some very expensive lessons. End quote. The battle escalated after that. One night, I caught contractors digging near my northern boundary. They were attempting to create a second access road into the subdivision. I launched my drone and started recording. The footage showed workers, equipment, maps, and construction plans spread across folding tables. Then somebody spotted the drone. Seconds later, a spotlight locked onto it. A loud crack echoed through the darkness. My drone spiraled out of the sky. Somebody had fired a shot. I hit the dirt and stayed there. By sunrise, the footage was already backed up online. Luke forwarded everything to county officials. Sheriff Nolan Briggs received a copy too. The sheriff wasn't Apos, T amused. Neither was the county zoning office. Yet somehow Silver Hollow Estates kept pushing. Within a week, they started paving a road toward my property. Fresh asphalt. Bright yellow center lines. Professional crews. They acted like permits were optional suggestions. That and Apos. When I called Barry Holloway, a county inspector I and Apos, D known for years. Barry arrived in an old truck that looked older than both of us combined. He walked the site, reviewed permits, and spent nearly an hour shaking his head. End quote. These folks have lost their minds. End quote. He finally muttered. Then he shut the project down on the spot. Construction stopped. Equipment left. The HOA board exploded. Things became personal after that. Security cameras caught 2 masked men entering my barn one night, carrying fuel containers. The footage clearly showed them preparing to start a fire. They fled before deputies arrived, but the message was obvious. Somebody wanted me gone. I printed screenshots from the footage and attached them to that sign drove them absolutely crazy. A few days later, I visited an elderly rancher named Walter Boone. Walter had once owned most of the land that eventually became Silver Hollow Estates. Over iced tea on his porch, he revealed something interesting. End quote. Developers get greedy, end quote, he said. End quote. Sometimes they forget things, end quote, end quote. What kind of things, end quote, I asked. He grinned. End quote. Little parcels. Tiny strips. Forgotten pieces nobody pays attention to, end quote. My interest immediately skyrocketed. Walter still owned several narrow pieces of land running through parts of the subdivision. A strip under a walking trail. Another beneath decorative landscaping. One that crossed part of the clubhouse parking lot. 2 weeks later, I owned them all. I didn't endopos, block anything. Not yet. I simply placed small signs identifying the property boundaries. The reaction was immediate. Residents flooded HOA meetings demanding answers. Preston looked exhausted every time I saw him. His confident smile was gone. Veronica looked like she hadn't endopos, slept in days. Then came the biggest surprise of all. 3 days before our court hearing, a local reporter named Claire Monroe aired an investigative segment about the situation. The story exploded. Millions of views. National attention. People across the country watched footage of the fence, the fake road project, the drone incident, and the escalating legal war. Suddenly, Silver Hollow Estates wasn't endopos, viewed as a prestigious community anymore. It looked like a cautionary tale. The pressure started breaking people. Board members turned on each other. Residents demanded resignations. Sponsors withdrew support from community projects. Then, 2 nights before court, someone knocked on my door at 2 in the morning. I stepped outside expecting trouble. Instead, I found Veronica Hale standing alone under the porch light. She looked exhausted, defeated, different. She held out a flash drive. End quote. What endopos is this? End quote. I asked. Her eyes dropped toward the ground. End quote. Everything. End quote. End quote. Everything. End quote. End quote. Internal emails. Meeting recordings. Development plans. They weren't endopos. Trying to pressure you into compliance. End quote. She looked up at me. End quote. They were trying to force you to sell. End quote. My stomach tightened. End quote. For how long? End quote. End quote. Since the beginning. End quote. She swallowed hard. End quote. The entire subdivision expansion depended on acquiring your ranch. End quote. Suddenly, every strange letter, every survey marker, every confrontation made sense. They never wanted cooperation. They wanted ownership. Veronica handed me the drive. End quote. Use it. End quote. Then she turned and walked into the darkness. I stood there staring after her for a long time. Because I knew one thing for certain. When court started in 48 hours, Silver Hollow Estates wasn't endopos, walking into a hearing anymore. They were walking into an avalanche. The courtroom was packed before the hearing even started. Reporters filled the back rows. Cameras waited outside. Residents from Silver Hollow Estates sat shoulder to shoulder with ranchers, farmers, and curious locals who wanted to see how this strange war would end. On one side sat Preston Vale and 3 expensive attorneys surrounded by stacks of binders. On the other side sat me and my cousin Luke. That was it. No giant legal team. No mountain of paperwork. Just us. Judge Eleanor Whitaker entered exactly at 9:00 endopos clock and called the room to order. She looked like the kind of judge who had heard every lie imaginable and had grown tired of all of them 20 years ago. After preliminary arguments, Preston endopos' lead attorney stood and launched into a polished speech about community interests, development rights, safety concerns, and responsible neighborhood planning. It sounded impressive right up until Luke stood up. End quote. Your Honor, end quote. He said calmly, end quote. My client ISN endopos, here to defend himself, end quote. The attorney frowned. Luke smiled, end quote. He endopos, here to show what actually happened, end quote. The room went quiet. Then the avalanche began. First came the property records proving Silver Hollow Estates knowingly built barriers designed to pressure me. Then came emails discussing strategies to reduce my property endopos' value. Internal memos described me as an obstacle to expansion. Another referred to my ranch as the final piece of the puzzle. The judge endopos' expression grew colder with every document. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Then Luke played the recordings from the flash drive. Voices filled the courtroom. HOA board members discussing ways to force me into selling. Conversations about creating legal pressure. Discussions about harassment campaigns. Even plans to overwhelm me with fines and administrative complaints until I simply gave up. You could hear people gasping in the gallery. One resident stood up and walked out shaking his head. Then came the final blow. Luke displayed an internal development map. The entire future expansion of Silver Hollow Estates depended on acquiring my ranch. New roads, new luxury homes, a golf course, commercial property. Everything led straight through my land. The fence had never been about aesthetics. The letters had never been about compliance. The HOA had spent years trying to force a sale without paying the actual value of the property. Judge Whitaker leaned forward. End quote. Mr. Vale, end quote, she said quietly. End quote. Is there any legitimate explanation for these documents? End quote. Preston opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. For the first time since I and Appos known him, he looked genuinely afraid. The hearing continued for another 2 hours. By the end, the outcome felt inevitable. Judge Whitaker removed her glasses and looked directly at the HOA board. End quote. This court has seen